إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues. I think we can start. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I hereby declare open the 10th meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council. We shall now proceed with the global update of the High Commissioner. It is my honor to welcome Mr. Volker Türk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Terima kasih banyak. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. The world is upside down. We all feel it. Discussions on power are everywhere. Who has power? How power is shifting? How power will evolve? Players compete for control over land, energy, attention. But to what end? Dominating the global economy? Accumulating more power? Putting AI into space? Surely, power must serve other purposes. If you ask people around the world what they want from power, the answers are the same: peace, safety, a decent standard of living. In short, people desperately want their human rights. Ask Gen Z protesting in the streets. Ask human rights defenders in prison for speaking up against oppression. Ask those risking their lives for their principles. They have entrusted their leaders with upholding human rights. When those leaders ignore their people, trust breaks. And when they use power for their own ends, they exploit and subjugate. Human rights and the rule of law based on those rights prevent the powerful from doing whatever they want. They reject domination and subjugation. They represent how people want to live. Human rights are more popular than populism. Growing up in a small state and studying law during the Cold War taught me that international law and cooperation are a lifeline in times of crisis. Don't be fooled. Even the most powerful people in the world rely on others and on the law for everything. Mr. President, the threat and use of force to solve disputes is becoming more frequent and normalized. The number of armed conflicts has almost doubled since 2010 to around 60. Attacks on civilians are up by almost 1/3. The world is really becoming a more dangerous place. No one in their right mind wants that. Conflict is a human rights wasteland, literally, and for people living through it. We must not revert to violence as an organizing principle. It is baffling that political leaders are not taking urgent steps to reverse these trends. Instead, some of them are attacking the institutions designed to keep us safe: the United Nations, including the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, this Council, and its mechanisms. I wish they would put their time and energy into the real challenges. For example, the nuclear arms race unfolding before our eyes. Strategic nuclear weapons are designed to kill vast numbers of people. I'm deeply concerned that there are now no binding limits on the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world, those of the Russian Federation and the United States. I hope the two countries concerned will put in place a successor to the New START treaty immediately. And I call on all states to recommit to nuclear non-proliferation. Distinguished delegates, around the world, we are witnessing blatant violations of international law. In Sudan, advanced weapon systems are used in residential areas and to destroy humanitarian convoys and prevent aid from reaching starving children. In Ukraine, civilians have endured weeks of sub-zero temperatures without electricity, heating and water as the Russian Federation destroys vital infrastructure, impacting entire cities. In the occupied Palestinian territory, Israel pursues its annexation project in flagrant breach of international law and the Palestinian right to self-determination. In Myanmar, the military continues its violent campaign to suppress the desire of its own people for democracy and justice. I thank the Council for its attention to these crises, and I refer you to all the statements at the relevant dialogues. A focus on individual conflicts cannot be allowed to obscure the bigger picture. 10 years ago, an attack on a hospital triggered a global outcry. Those responsible rushed to explain that they had made a mistake. Recent figures show that there are now, on average, of 10 attacks per day on healthcare. Warring parties try to justify their actions by exploiting ambiguities in the law and, frankly, by lying. The pattern is clear. Ignoring atrocity crimes fuels greater bloodshed. The world cannot stand by as the edifice of international humanitarian and human rights law is dismantled before our eyes. States, in fact everyone, need to stand up for universalism and against a descent into competing narratives and historical allegiances. That starts with recording and analyzing the facts and applying the same rigorous standards to everyone without exception. From Sudan to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the occupied Palestinian territory, to Myanmar and across the Sahel, we, the human rights ecosystem, are shedding light on the competition for power and resources that drives conflict and how it can be stopped. In Yemen, protracted civil wars have shattered state institutions, destroyed infrastructure, and displaced millions. Competing regional powers have also fueled violence. Yemen is now one of the worst human rights and humanitarian crises in the world. The risk of famine is back for the first time since 2022. I condemn the continued arbitrary detention and mistreatment by the Houthis of scores of UN staff, including my own. I categorically reject all allegations against them, and I call for their immediate release. I also condemn the arbitrary detention of thousands of other Yemenis and urge their release. In Ethiopia, armed clashes between the National Army and the Tigray security forces have led to mass displacement, limited humanitarian access, and retaliatory arrests of civilians. Fighting in Amhara and the situation in Oromia are also cause for serious concern. The implementation of the peace agreement has stalled, and tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea risk further escalation. The transitional justice process is on pause, delaying a nationally led accountability initiative. I call on all parties to strengthen the protection of civilians, to de-escalate, and to exercise the utmost constraint. In South Sudan, I am appalled that civilians are bearing the brunt of indiscriminate military attacks by opposition and government forces, including aerial bombardments, and are being subjected to conflict-related sexual violence. The human rights situation in Syria remains precarious, with widespread civilian suffering and displacement. My office verified that civilians have been killed in hostilities between the government and the Syrian Democratic Forces in Aleppo City and in Raqqa. Repeated Israeli incursions and cross-border strikes have also undermined stability and harmed civilians. Transitional justice and accountability are critical, and the political agreement between the government and the SDF needs to be implemented transparently and in full. Turning to Lebanon, where my staff have documented that 137 civilians have been killed in Israeli strikes since the ceasefire in November 2024. Any renewal of wide-scale hostilities would be devastating for civilians. Distinguished delegates, across these different conflicts, we need some clear actions. First, a ban on the sale or transfer of weapons where there is a risk they could be used to violate international law. Second, an end to hate speech and dehumanizing rhetoric. Governments and social media companies need to work this out. Third, accountability through credible investigations and prosecutions, including by increasing the use of universal jurisdiction. And fourth, human rights confidence-building measures which can help to create the political space for dialogue and peace-building. My office is developing such measures and sharing them with those involved in crises in several places around the world, including Ukraine, Sudan, and Venezuela. Our proposals are based on lessons learned from previous peace processes from Colombia to the former Yugoslavia. There is a need for human rights-based negotiations that bring parties to conflict together around converging interests, like protecting civilians, clarifying the fate of missing people, and ending arbitrary arrests. In both Thailand and Cambodia, for example, my office has advocated to build on the ceasefire and to engage in human rights-based steps towards peace. Distinguished delegates, disrespect for international law is echoed in disrespect for human rights at the national level, where there are deeply worrying setbacks. The situation in Iran remains volatile after the authorities killed thousands in a lethal crackdown in January. Recent days have seen a new wave of protests at universities, making it clear that the underlying grievances remain. There are continued reports of repression, including arrests and pressure on academic spaces. Thousands of people are still missing. I'm horrified by reports that at least 8 people, including 2 children, have been sentenced to death in connection with the protests. Another 30 are reportedly at risk of the same sentence. I urge independent, impartial, and transparent investigations fair trial guarantees, and an immediate moratorium on the death penalty. I'm extremely alarmed about the potential for regional military escalation and its impact on civilians, and I hope the voice of reason prevails. Mr. President, authoritarians around the world follow a familiar playbook. Governments adopt vague laws under the guise of national security, criminalize peaceful criticism, and use heavy-handed tactics to respond to dissent. They control information by capturing some channels for propaganda while shutting down or censoring others. Human rights defenders, independent media, and dissenting voices are arrested, threatened, subjected to surveillance, and even killed. Civil society groups are branded as the agents of foreign powers, and their funding is cut. The authoritarian undermines judicial institutions by co-opting, overriding, or abolishing them. And all the while, women and minority groups, migrants, LGBTIQ+ people, religious minorities are scapegoated and blamed for all of society's ills. We see this playbook used in many countries today. Mr. President, several countries are militarizing their law enforcement operation. Across the Sahel, human rights defenders and journalists are arbitrarily arrested and detained, independent media banned, and political parties dissolved as part of a militarized response to violent extremism. I am concerned about the 4-year state of emergency in El Salvador and the use of mass trials. Efforts against organized crime need to be undertaken in line with due process. I'm also troubled by reports of high numbers of deaths in custody. Likewise, in Ecuador, very concerned about reports of hundreds of deaths in prison, both from violence and from disease. In the United States, immigration and other agents have used excessive force during large-scale operations against migrants and peaceful protesters, and have shot and killed several people during these operations. Authorities in Cameroon and Uganda used excessive force, detained political opponents and critics, and imposed severe restrictions on civic space before, during, and after elections. In a welcome development, Tanzania established a national commission to investigate violations that took place around the elections in October. Elections in Guinea last December marked the transition to the restoration of a constitutional order. However, serious violations persist, including restricted civic space, enforced disappearances, and digital shutdowns. Mr. President, in Colombia, where my office documented 32 killings of political leaders in 2025, I am troubled by the security situation in the run-up to elections scheduled for May. In Peru, I am concerned about attacks on judicial independence and measures undermining the separation of powers ahead of elections later this year. I encourage the authorities in Colombia and Peru, as well as in Benin, Ethiopia and Nepal, to uphold human rights and safeguard civic space in upcoming election processes. I welcome the peaceful conduct of the recent elections in Bangladesh and its transition process. I look forward to engaging with the new government to support institutional reform, accountability and healing that needs to include all of society. In Madagascar and Nepal, I urge all stakeholders to commit to genuine reforms that respond to the aspirations of Gen Z protesters last year. Mr. President, outside electoral periods and across all regions, governments are tightening restrictions on civic space. The authorities in Belarus, Egypt, India, the Russian Federation, Tunisia, Turkey and beyond continue to prosecute civil society activists under counter-terrorism legislation. In Pakistan, lawyers and human rights defenders have been jailed for crucial social media posts. In Georgia, I regret the restrictions on civic space. In Venezuela, I note the release of some people who were arbitrarily detained and urge the release of the remainder. The state of the emergency should be reviewed to ensure it respects civic space and human rights. Civil society and victims groups must also be able to participate meaningfully in public affairs. I will provide an update on the situation on the 16th of March. In China, I urge the authorities to stop using vague criminal, administrative and national security provisions to suppress the peaceful exercise of fundamental rights. I urge them to release all those arbitrarily detained. I regret the lack of follow-up by the authorities on previous recommendations and an accountability to protect the rights of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang and of Tibetans in their regions. This includes labor issues and religious and cultural freedoms. I'm also concerned by the intensified repression of Protestant communities. In Sri Lanka, I urge the government to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act and to work with civil society to ensure that new legislation complies with human rights law. During my recent trip to India, I was impressed by the vibrancy of civil society. They play a key role in upholding India's democratic traditions and the rights of minorities. It is important for civic space to be vigorously defended and for civil society to be able to do their work without hindrance. Globally, attacks on free and independent media are alarming. Over the past 3.5 years, 310 journalists were killed, and 85% of these killings were unpunished. Journalists are detained, threatened, and subjected to surveillance for investigating corruption and organized crime. Women journalists are particularly exposed to violence and abuse online. Mr. President, attacks on minorities are continuing as some states retreat from their commitments to prevent and address discrimination. Africans and people of African descent are subjected to racial profiling and excessive use of force across several regions. I have consistently condemned the impunity that persists. I call for full accountability, which is key to combating systemic racism in law enforcement and to restoring trust. Indigenous peoples continue to be denied their rights to land and to free, prior, and informed consent in mining and other commercial projects. Other groups face discrimination on the basis of their work or their descent. I'm alarmed by reports showing a sharp increase in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of religious hate across several regions. The rise of hate speech against migrants and refugees, including in Europe, Libya, the United States of America, is a deeply worrying trend. In the European Union, proposed new rules on returns of migrants risk further restricting their access to healthcare and education and expanding the use of detention. I'm very concerned that some European states are putting political pressure on the European Court of Human Rights around migration issues. I urge states to address the exclusion and discrimination against Roma across Europe. People and organizations working to defend LGBTIQ+ rights have been targeted in Hungary and Turkey and beyond, which is a worrying trend. Mr. President, women and girls are facing intensifying threats to their rights. In Afghanistan, as I briefed this Council yesterday, the system of segregation imposed on women is reminiscent of apartheid, based on gender rather than race. Both the Pellicot case and the Epstein files show the extent of the exploitation and abuse of women and girls. Does anyone think there are not many more men like Dominique Pellicot or Jeffrey Epstein? Such horrific abuse is enabled by social systems that silence women and girls and insulate powerful men from accountability. States must investigate all alleged crimes, protect survivors, and ensure justice without fear or favor. More broadly, violence against women, including femicide, is a global emergency. Around 50,000 women and girls worldwide were killed in 2024, most by family members. I'm also deeply concerned by the growing number of attacks, including online, against women in public life. Every woman politician I meet tells me they face constant misogyny and online hate. Mr. President, on a positive note, I'm pleased to have signed a host country agreement this week with the government of Mozambique. Monsieur le Président, nos systèmes...
Mr. President, our economic systems are also built on dominance and subjugation, which exacerbates inequalities between and within countries. The 2030 agenda is alarmingly off track, with many goals now slipping into reverse. Drastic cuts in international development aid are projected to lead to more than 22 million avoidable deaths by 2030. Around the world, 1 person in 4 faces food insecurity and 1 in 3 lacks adequate housing. The commitments made in Seville and Doha last year on financing for development point the way forward, but they need to be matched by genuine political will to reform the international financial system and enable all countries to access the resources needed for sustainable development. Meanwhile, last year alone, billionaires amassed enough wealth to eliminate extreme poverty 26 times over. And in some countries, unjust economic blockades are holding ordinary people captive. In Cuba, the long-standing economic crisis has been compounded by recent US restrictions on access to
acceso al combustible, que han llevado al país al borde del colapso. Los niños con cáncer mueren sin medicación ni tratamiento. Las mujeres embarazadas luchan por obtener la alimentación y la atención que necesitan. Sea cual sea el objetivo de esas sanciones y aranceles, nada puede justificar la asfixia de toda una población. Los gobiernos tampoco invierten adecuadamente en los derechos de las personas porque no pueden o eligen no hacerlo. Muchos sistemas tributarios recompensan a los ricos y no protegen a quienes enfrentan dificultades. Las consecuencias de las profundas desigualdades que existen en algunos países son devastadoras. The measure of progress should not be more money. It is whether the economy is improving people's well-being. Poverty, unemployment, and the lack of social protection, combined with limited pathways for safe migration, make people vulnerable to brutal exploitation. A recent report by my office highlighted grave abuses against people trafficked into scam centers across several regions. Last year, my office worked with more than 35 governments, from Bangladesh, Chile, Colombia, Djibouti, and Iraq to Kenya, Papua New Guinea, Sri Lanka, and Scotland in the UK, on integrating human rights into budgeting, taxation, land and anti-corruption efforts, and housing policies, helping ensure they protect the most vulnerable. Distinguished delegates, business has an immense role to play in the shift that our economies so urgently need. There is a long-standing misconception that business and human rights stand on opposite sides of the barricades. This is wrong. There is ample evidence that companies that respect human rights also perform better financially. Human rights due diligence strengthens the trust of investors and communities and attracts better employees. Business leaders are also speaking out against the troubling direction the world is taking. For example, in the United States, amid rising tension over immigration in Minnesota, more than 60 CEOs of companies based in the state called for de-escalation and peaceful solutions. In the European Union, several major brands voiced concern over the weakening of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And I hope to see more companies leverage their power to transform societies for the better. Mr. President, the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity loss and pollution, and the development of new technologies without guardrails have deep implications for human rights. In the first 2 months of 2026, floods affected nearly 1 million people in southern Africa, while wildfires devastated Chile. No country can solve the climate crisis alone. But at the global level, short-termism rules. Climate negotiations in Brazil failed to deliver a decision on phasing out fossil fuels, which science dictates is essential to preventing climate chaos around the world. A few states prevented the action needed to protect all of humanity. The current temperature trajectory will lead to a catastrophic rise of at least 2.3 degrees by the end of this century. This is all the more shocking in light of the economic and security benefits of renewable energy. Nobody ever went to war over a wind farm. We desperately need urgent climate action that is responsive to people's demands, especially people in small island developing states. And I welcome their increased representation in this Council. We also need far more investment in adaptation, mitigation, and a just transition. I often wonder how future generations will judge our leaders' actions and their fatal inaction on the climate crisis. The International Court of Justice has made clear the legal obligation to act urgently and meaningfully. 30 to 50 years from now, could today's inadequate response be considered ecocide or even a crime against humanity? Mr. President, today, debate around tech always leads to artificial intelligence, and AI is about power, so it is intrinsically connected to human rights. AI is controlled by a handful of companies led by billionaires who have enormous power over the forces reshaping societies for better or worse. AI systems are already helping to support and protect human rights, predicting crisis and conflict, advancing progress in healthcare and education, helping to solve global challenges like food insecurity. But without adequate oversight and accountability, digital technologies invade privacy, undermine democratic processes, and pose serious risks to the safety of our children and ourselves. They also turbocharge inequality and reproduce existing biases. I'm extremely concerned by the use of AI systems in armed conflict to shape battlefield decisions with deadly impact. Two steps are urgently needed. First, we need to increase and democratize investment in AI for the public good. Incentives should reward companies for delivering AI that benefits people rather than profits. Second, human rights need to be hardwired into AI design, development, and deployment. And states have a responsibility to regulate the safety of these technologies. The Independent Scientific Panel on AI is an important milestone, and I count on it to embed strong human rights expertise and robust civil society participation in its work. Mr. President, the final move in the authoritarian playbook is persuading people that they are powerless. But human rights remind us that we are not. Our choices, our voices, our votes determine what comes next. The future depends on each of us. We need to forge coalitions to champion what unites us. In the coming weeks, as I said at the opening, we will set in motion a global alliance for human rights to capture the energy and the commitment that I feel everywhere I go. It will represent the quiet majority who strive for a fairer, more peaceful and compassionate world. And that is what we are working for. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we shall now continue the interactive dialogue on the High Commissioner's report on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. We continue with the list of speakers. I would like to recall that although the duration of the interactive dialogues is 1 hour and 30 minutes, if time permits, additional delegations will be able to speak. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lebanon thanks the High Commissioner and his office for their continued reporting on the grave situation in the OPTs, where every human right has been violated by Israel. Gaza continues enduring a man-made humanitarian crisis, with children suffering the most, including unprecedented amputations and lifelong physical and psychological impacts. The situation in East Jerusalem and West Bank is also alarming due to illegal forcible transfer. While we note the ceasefire and recent political development, the scale of suffering requires urgent international attention. We are deeply concerned by restrictions on humanitarian access and attacks on UN entities, including UNRWA. We also deplore the liquidity crisis that delayed the report on arms transfers, as transparency and scrutiny are crucial amid such violations. The international community must act decisively to address ongoing violations and alleviate the humanitarian crisis. Israel must fully comply with its obligations under international law, including the ICJ's provisional measures. Ending impunity, ensuring accountability, and ending occupation remain essential for Palestinians to exercise their right to self-determination. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, President. We thank the High Commissioner for his detailed, deeply disturbing and indeed alarming report. We support the COI and other UN mechanisms. Turkey also supports the international mechanisms established to lay the groundwork for lasting peace, including the Board of Peace. As Turkey's views are reflected in the OIC statement, I'll underline a few urgent points. The ceasefire is essential to stop further bloodshed and to create space for unhindered humanitarian assistance, early recovery and meaningful political engagement. Secondly, humanitarian assistance must be significantly increased and allowed to flow without obstruction. Thirdly, the effective functioning of the National Committee for Administration of Gaza is vital for the success of the comprehensive plan. Recovery and reconstruction must begin without delay. Israel must withdraw from Gaza, not expand its occupation. Last but not least, rising tensions in the West Bank are deeply concerning. The expansion of illegal settlements is contrary to international law. My country remains firmly committed to a just and lasting two-state solution grounded in relevant UN resolutions and international law. We stand in full solidarity with the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Sovereign Order of Malta remains deeply concerned over the grave human rights situation in the OPTs and thanks the High Commissioner for his report. We echo his call for accountability for violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. In the West Bank, the increase of settler violence and blockades render our abilities to serve the people in need even more difficult through our maternity hospital in Bethlehem and its mobile clinics. We reaffirm the need to protect the right to freedom of religion or belief and access to places of worship, ensuring the respect of the status quo of the holy sites. In Gaza, unimpeded and large-scale humanitarian access must be granted immediately. The Order of Malta is ready to provide emergency humanitarian aid once access is granted, as it has done in the past. We reiterate our firm opposition to any forms of forced displacement of the Palestinian population. Mr. President, all parties must abide by their obligations under international law, in particular IHL, and respect the decisions of the International Court of Justice. The Order of Malta calls for an end of all hostilities that still persist and a lasting peace so that the people of Israel and Palestine can live side by side in peace, security, tolerance and in a human rights compliant manner. Mr. High Commissioner, how can we better protect the rights of religious minorities in the OPTs? I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The unwavering support of the people and government of Eritrea for the legitimate right of the Palestinian people to self-determination remains steadfast, regardless of time or circumstance. Eritrea firmly maintains that the Palestinian people are entitled to a sovereign and independent state. This position rests on clear legal, political, and moral foundations. It is evident that the international community has fallen short in its responsibilities towards the Palestinian people. The stark double standards have been apparent from the outset, exposing the systemic flaws and duplicity of the existing global order under certain powers. Consequently, the human tragedy of the Palestinian people has been appeased and sustained by these dubious powers against the founding pillars of the UN Charter and international law. The right to self-determination of the Palestinian people is a natural and lawful entitlement that must not be compromised at any time and under any pretext. A just and lasting peace in the region is only possible when the Palestinian people are allowed to freely determine their own future, free from external occupation, coercion, and interference. What they require is not only expressions of solidarity, but tangible and decisive action that guarantees their ultimate freedom and independence. Palestinians, like Israelis and any other people in the world, deserve to live in peace and tranquility. We wish for the Palestinian people what we wish for ourselves: peace, freedom, and the full realization of their right to self-determination. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يشكر وفد سلطنة عمان مكتب المفوض السامي على تقرير المقدم، ويؤكد تحفظه على أي مقاربة تضع سلطة الاحتلال وشعب الوقت تحت الاحتلال في كفة واحدة. إن استمرار الاحتلال واختلال ميزان القوة يفرضان مسؤولية قانونية واضحة بموجب القانون الدولي، ولا يجوز إغفال هذه الحقيقة عند تناول الوضع القائم. كما تعرف بلادي عن قلقها أزاء عدم استكمال التقرير المتعلق يضمن المساءلة والعدالة بذريعة النقص الموارد، إذ إن جسامة الانتهاكات وحجم المعاناة الإنسانية يقتضيان أولوية قصوى لهذا المسار، تفاديا لضعف منظومة الحماية الدولية ومبدأ عدم الإفلات من العقاب. سيد الرئيس، تدين سلطنة عمان بأشد العبارات استمرار الانتهاكات الجسيمة للقانون الدولي الإنساني في غزة والضفة الغربية بما فيها القدس الشرقية، ولا سيما استهداف المدنيين وتهجير القسري وتدمير البنية التحتية. وتطالب بلادي بوقف فوري لهذه الانتهاكات وضمان حماية المدنيين ورفع القيود على المسائل الإنسانية ومسألة مسؤولين عن الجرائم المرتكبة. ختاما، تؤكد سلطنة عمان دعمها الثابت لحق الشعب الفلسطيني في تقرير المصير، وقامت دولته المستقلة على الحدود 4 يونيو 1967 وعاصمة القدس الشرقية وفق قرارات الشرعية الدولية. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. El Perú agradece al Alto Comisionado por la presentación de su informe sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en los territorios palestinos ocupados, incluida Jerusalén Oriental, y expresa su profunda preocupación por el elevado número de víctimas mortales, entre ellas mujeres y niños, así como por el grave y sostenido deterioro de las condiciones de vida de la población civil. La persistencia de la hambruna, la malnutrición generalizada y el colapso de los servicios de salud evidencian una crisis humanitaria de proporciones alarmantes que demanda una respuesta urgente, eficaz y sostenida por parte de la comunidad internacional. El informe da cuenta de numerosos ataques en zonas residenciales, así como contra personal humanitario y sanitario, lo que resulta profundamente preocupante. En este contexto, reiteramos que todas las partes deben cumplir de manera estricta y en todo momento con sus obligaciones en virtud del derecho internacional humanitario y del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Presidente, para concluir, deseo reafirmar el compromiso del Perú con el respeto del derecho internacional y la solución de dos estados que coexistan en paz y seguridad dentro de fronteras reconocidas internacionalmente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for the presentation of the report and take note of its findings with grave concern. The situation described in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza, reflects an alarming and unacceptable scale of civilian suffering. In this regard, Somalia aligns itself with the statements delivered by the Arab Group, Africa Group, and the OIC. the continued loss of civilian life, widespread destruction of homes and essential infrastructure, large-scale displacement and severe restrictions on humanitarian access raise profound concerns under the international humanitarian and international human rights law. International law clearly defines the obligations of an occupying power. The protection of civilians, the facilitation of humanitarian assistance, and the prohibition of collective punishment are binding legal duties. Somalia underscores that the consistent application of international law without selectivity or double standards is essential to safeguarding the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all states and maintaining trust in the multilateral system. Somalia calls for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, full and impeded humanitarian access, and strict compliance with international law. Accountability for violations must be ensured through appropriate and credible legal mechanisms. The Palestinian people's right to self-determination remains unalienable. A just and lasting peace can only be achieved through respect for international law and relevant UN nations resolutions. Mr. President, the credibility of this Council depends on the consistent and principled application of international law. Somalia reiterates its call for the protection.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the League of Arab States.
السيد الرئيس، تعرف جامعة الدول العربية بعد اطلاعها على تقرير المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان عن إدانتها الشديدة للوضع المتردي والمفزع الذي وصفه التقرير بشأن حالة حقوق الإنسان في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، والذي يوثق مجددا انتهاكات جسيمة وواسعة النطاق للقانون الدولي الإنساني وقانون حقوق الإنسان ارتكبتها إسرائيل السلطة القائمة بالاحتلال في كل من قطاع غزة والضفة الغربية، ويثير مخاوف خطيرة بشأن النقل القسري والتطهير العرقي واستخدام الترهيب والتجويع كسلاح حرب. وترى جميع الدول العربية أن ما عرضه التقرير يؤكد وجود نمط منهجي من الانتهاكات الإسرائيلية التي أدت إلى كارثة إنسانية غير مسبوقة في قطاع غزة وتصعيد خطير في الضفة الغربية شامل استهداف المدنيين وتدمير البنية التحتية والاعتقال التعسفي ومصادرة الأراضي والممتلكات الفلسطينية والتوسع الاستيطاني والتهجير القسري في ظل إفلات مستمر من العقاب والمحاسبة. وتشدد جامعة الدول العربية على أن المساءلة عن هذه الانتهاكات ليست خيارا سياسيا بل التزاما قانوني، وتدعو المجتمع الدولي إلى اتخاذ إجراءات فورية وملموسة لوقف العدوان الإسرائيلي وضمان حماية المدنيين في غزة والضفة الغربية وتأمين وصول المساعدات دون عوائق ودعم آليات العدالة الدولية بما يكفل إنهاء الاحتلال وتمكين الشعب الفلسطيني من ممارسة حقه غير القابل للتصرف في تقرير المصير وإقامة دولته المستقلة. وشكرا.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand thanks the High Commissioner for his report. We commend all efforts to consolidate the ceasefire and advance the implementation of the comprehensive plan pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2803 and the New York Declaration on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution. We welcome progress in the first phase, including the return of all hostages, among them Thai nationals, and the increased humanitarian access. However, Gaza's population remains in need of assistance, which must be delivered at scale and without restriction. Thailand continues to support these efforts through UNRWA, the Egyptian Red Crescent, and recently with a $100,000 contribution to the ICRC. Thailand reaffirms its full support for a peaceful resolution based on the two-state solution, by which Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security. This must be grounded in full respect for human rights, international law, and relevant UN resolutions, in which the aspirations of Palestinians for dignity and self-determination are addressed. We urge all parties to adhere to the agreed terms and engage constructively to advance the second phase of the comprehensive plan towards a peaceful and lasting solution. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Mr. President, Portugal expresses its profound concern at the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. The latest report of the High Commissioner presents a dire account of civilian casualties, forced displacement, destruction of homes and infrastructure, settlement expansion, and severe restrictions on access to essential services. Such actions are unacceptable and must cease immediately. Full respect for international law is imperative, and alleged violations must be investigated promptly and impartially to ensure accountability. We recall Israel's obligations as the occupying power, as well as the legally binding orders of the International Court of Justice, and reaffirm our support for the independence of the International Criminal Court. Portugal stresses the urgent need to guarantee safe and unhindered humanitarian access and aid, including food, water, healthcare and shelter. In this regard, we highlight UNRWA's indispensable role. Lasting peace and security cannot be achieved through force, but through dialogue and respect for international law. We urge all parties to refrain from unilateral actions that undermine prospects for peace. Portugal reaffirms its commitment to the peace process, recognizing that collective engagement remains essential to fostering a path towards a just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for his report, and New Zealand welcomes the UN Security Council Resolution 2803 and the move to Phase 2 of the peace plan. All parties must fulfil their commitments under the plan. Hamas must demilitarise and Israel must continue its phased withdrawal. We're extremely concerned by the increase in ceasefire violations, which risks escalation and a breakdown of the peace deal. New Zealand is pleased to see the increase in humanitarian access reaching those in need, but we are deeply concerned by the ongoing restriction on humanitarian supplies, restriction of movement for humanitarian workers, and the deregistration of organisations delivering life-saving assistance. New Zealand calls on Israel to immediately reverse its deregistration of humanitarian NGOs and to cease blocking critical goods and supplies, including medical equipment, on the basis that it is dual use. The situation in the West Bank has deteriorated greatly. New Zealand is deeply concerned by Israel's recent moves to expand control over the West Bank. The International Court of Justice was clear in its conclusion that Israel's ongoing presence in the occupied territory is unlawful. This long-running conflict has brought immense pain and suffering. We call on all sides to return to dialogue so that future generations can live in peace.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for his comprehensive report. Bangladesh strongly condemns the indiscriminate killing of Palestinian civilians, including women and children, and the targeting of journalists, humanitarian workers, and medical personnel by the Israeli occupying forces. The report documents grave violations of human rights, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and the use of starvation as a method of war, creating a catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza and worsening violence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Such conduct is tantamount to war crimes and other crimes under international law. Bangladesh stresses the urgent need for accountability. We call for full implementation of the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice and respect for international judicial processes, including the work of the International Criminal Court. Impunity for crimes against humanity must not be allowed to persist. Bangladesh also reiterates its firm and unequivocal support for the UN Special Rapporteur on the OPT and discharge of her mandate without intimidation or political pressure. Finally, Bangladesh reaffirms its unwavering support for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to self-determination and for an end to Israel's occupation. A just and lasting peace can only be achieved through the establishment of a sovereign and independent state of Palestine along the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for his report. The Kingdom of the Netherlands expresses its high appreciation for the tireless work of the High Commissioner and his staff, also in these times when resources are increasingly scarce. The report before us outlines a wide range of serious human rights violations for which accountability is paramount. We are gravely concerned about the dire humanitarian situation and the devastating number of civilian casualties, including journalists. We also note the report's account of apparent targeted attacks on aid workers. We underscore that any willful targeting of humanitarian personnel is prohibited under the international law and gravely undermines the delivery of life-saving aid. Humanitarian staff should never be a target. And let me repeat again, humanitarian staff should never be a target. The entry of humanitarian relief should be facilitated, and therefore the Netherlands calls upon all parties to comply with international humanitarian law. We continue to strive for peace, justice and accountability. And in order to continue documentation and monitoring of human rights violations, we call upon all parties to cooperate with OHCHR and grant access to Gaza. High Commissioner, allow me to reiterate our continued support to your mandate and its independence. Testament to our support is our continued contribution to your work. And this year, the Kingdom of the Netherlands will make an additional contribution to OHCHR office for its work in the occupied Palestinian territories. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Gambia. The representative of Gambia does not appear to be here. We then move to the next speaker, which is the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
President Sierra Leone aligns itself with the statement delivered by the African Group and thanks the High Commissioner for the report in the OPT. We remain concerned about reports of bombing, the continued suffering of civilians, and the violations of the ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank. While the opening of the Rafah crossing has improved humanitarian access, major obstacles persist. Sierra Leone welcomes the diplomatic efforts of the United States and regional partners, but ongoing violations and deteriorating conditions threaten fragile progress. We are alarmed by reports of settlements, expansions, settler violence, forced displacements, and actions undermining the peace, and condemn excessive force, arbitrary detention, property destructions, and violations by Palestinian armed groups. All breaches of international humanitarian and human rights law must cease and accountability ensured. The protection of civilians and humanitarian personnel must remain paramount. Collective punishments, denial of assistance, and actions that may alter the territory's demographic composition are contrary to international law. Sierra Leone firmly supports a two-state solution that enables the realization of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine that lives alongside the State of Israel based on the 1967 borders. And I thank you, President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, merci pour votre rapport. La reconnaissance de la Palestine par la France en septembre dernier a marqué notre engagement constant en faveur d'une paix juste et durable, fondée sur la solution des deux États, Israël et Palestine, vivant côte à côte, en paix et en sécurité. La France réitère sa condamnation sans équivoque des attaques terroristes menées par le Hamas le 7 octobre 2023, pire massacre antisémite depuis la Shoah. La France salue les travaux du Haut-Commissaire et condamne toutes les violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme dans l'ensemble du territoire palestinien occupé. Après l'annonce du passage à la deuxième phase du cessez-le-feu et du plan de paix, la priorité doit porter sur la mise en œuvre effective des annonces. L'urgence absolue pour les Palestiniens de Gaza reste l'entrée massive, rapide et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire, acheminée et distribuée par les agences des Nations Unies, y compris l'UNRWA, le CICR et les ONG. Cela passe aussi par la fin des frappes et le désarmement du Hamas. Nous appelons toutes les parties au plus strict respect du cessez-le-feu. En Cisjordanie, les attaques des colons violents et l'accélération sans précédent de la colonisation sont contraires au droit international et s'inscrivent dans une trajectoire d'annexion de facto qui est inacceptable. Nous avons condamné à ce titre les mesures récentes visant à étendre les pouvoirs des autorités israéliennes en Cisjordanie qui remettent en cause les accords d'Oslo. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Mr. President, Greece aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for his report. We are deeply concerned by the findings of the report on the critical humanitarian situation in Gaza, the large-scale displacement of the population, the destruction of remaining civilian infrastructure, the acute shortage of health care, and other basic necessities underscore the extreme gravity of the situation on the ground. At the same time, we are alarmed by the escalating settler violence in the West Bank, including against Christian communities and threats of forcible displacement. We condemn all violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law in the occupied Palestinian territory, and we oppose any plan for annexation of the West Bank, which undermines the prospect of a negotiated two-state solution. We call on all parties to comply with their obligations under international law and for the immediate, safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to all those in need, in full respect of international humanitarian law. Greece remains committed to advancing a just and lasting peace, including through the implementation of the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict on the basis of the two-state solution and the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente. Chile agradece al alto comisionado la presentación del informe. Sus conclusiones reflejan una situación alarmante en Gaza y Cisjordania. Desde que inició el conflicto, cerca de 2 millones de personas han sido desplazadas forzosamente y más de 20.000 niños han muerto, provocando cambios demográficos permanentes en una generación de gazatíes. Los ataques contra hospitales, viviendas, escuelas e infraestructura civil esencial han dejado zonas en condiciones incompatibles con una vida digna. En Cisjordania, los palestinos desalojados son obligados a demoler sus viviendas o a financiar su destrucción, facilitando anexiones ilegales de territorio por Israel. Señor presidente, Chile manifiesta su preocupación por el desmantelamiento del sistema de asistencia humanitaria de Naciones Unidas llevado a cabo por Israel y la creciente militarización con la ayuda de la zona de conflicto. Como indica el informe, los gazatíes han sido forzados a enfrentar una elección inaceptable, padecer hambre o arriesgar la vida al intentar acceder a alimentos. La instrumentalización de la hambruna y de la ayuda humanitaria en Gaza es un precedente negativo para futuras crisis. Alentamos a los Estados a respaldar la labor humanitaria de Naciones Unidas y el fortalecimiento del multilateralismo. Chile llama a que la reconstrucción y gobernanza de Gaza se lleve a cabo con la participación de los palestinos, un compromiso claro con la solución de 2 estados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights for his report and reiterate our full support for the independence, integrity and impartiality of your office. Again, we are horrified by the facts shared in your report. Facts that speak of the untenable situation in which the people of Gaza live, especially women and children. Despite the ceasefire, Gaza is still not at peace. The protection of civilians in strict accordance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law remains paramount. We continue calling for lifting of all restrictions on humanitarian aid and humanitarian operations, including NGO registration. We urge Israel to ensure UNRWA can continue its vital work as mandated by the UN General Assembly. Chillingly, the report attributes starvation directly to actions taken by the Israeli government. This constitutes a war crime. Accountability must be ensured where there are credible allegations of serious violations, especially where actions appear to aim at permanent demographic shift in Gaza. Slovenia also expresses its profound concern over recurring attacks against UN officials, mandate holders, judicial officials, and employees of international organizations. The international community depends on impartiality of these independent mechanisms, an essential element of their work, and attacks on them undermine their mandate. Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker we could accommodate. We will now turn to our list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to the representative of Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy. It's an intervention by video.
Mr. High Commissioner,
As we convene today, the situation in the occupied West Bank, including Jerusalem, remains deeply alarming. Recent measures by the Israeli government pose the threat of de facto annexation of Palestinian land, contributing to ongoing forced displacement and replacement with illegal Israeli settlers. These developments carry severe and distinctly gendered consequences. For Palestinian women, forced displacement results not only in the loss of housing, but also in the erosion of community networks, social protection, and economic stability. Many women face overcrowded living conditions, limited privacy, and inadequate sanitation. These conditions heighten vulnerability and significantly restrict access to healthcare, including maternal and reproductive services. What's more, during the holy month of Ramadan, Israel has accelerated its arrest campaign, arresting over 100 Palestinians. Over 9,300 Palestinians are held in Israeli prisons, including 350 children and 66 women, many being held without charge or trial and facing life-threatening conditions. In the Gaza Strip, the effects of Israel's genocide on Gaza continues to disproportionately affect women and girls. Documentation from civil society organizations, including Miftah, indicates the intersecting patterns of violence by Israel, including sexual violence, reproductive violence, and starvation. Systematically attacking women undermines social cohesion and disrupts the continuity of Palestinian life. A gender-responsive analysis is therefore essential. Mr. High Commissioner, we respectfully urge sustained monitoring, accountability, and protection measures grounded in international human rights law, with particular attention to the disproportionate impact on Palestinian women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the Institute for NGO Research, intervention by video.
Thank you, Mr. President. The High Commissioner's report claims to be about accountability, but how can there be when it ignores the many actors that enabled Hamas's October 7 invasion of Israel and the maiming, rape, taking of hostages, and slaughter of thousands of civilians? The report ignores Qatar and Turkey's financing and harboring of Hamas terrorists. The report ignores the PAs paying terrorists to slay and whose official from this very podium welcomed the Gaza resistance. The report ignores the dozens of international aid NGOs who were complicit in Hamas's coercive control, allowing billions in taxpayer funds to be stolen for the terror group's war machine. The report ignores UNRWA, that allowed its takeover by Hamas and for decades indoctrinated children to hate and violence. There is nothing indispensable about this wrongdoing. The report ignores Iran, the key architect of the Hamas war and destruction in the region, its proxy armies wreaking mayhem in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The report ignores those supplying weapons to Iran and Hamas, instead promoting a wicked, one-sided arms embargo on Israel. Mr. President, the willful blindness and impunity from this council must stop. The time to start holding all complicit actors accountable for their role in this conflict is now.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Midline for Human Rights, intervention by video.
We thank the High Commissioner for the latest report on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. It provides a sobering account of ongoing violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law and underscores the urgent obligation to ensure accountability and justice for all affected communities. Between November 1st, 2024 and October 31st, 2025, the situation on the ground has remained dire, with persistent displacement, restrictions on movement, and obstacles to humanitarian access. The report highlights deeply concerning trends in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, where civilians continue to suffer from the effects of the protracted occupation and recurrent cycles of violence. We note with profound concern the exacerbation of deprivation, restricted access to essential services, and the reported destruction of homes, schools, and health infrastructure. These conditions fundamentally undermine the rights to life, security, and dignity. Accountability must be pursued consistently and impartially, and all parties must respect and uphold international law. We recall that lasting peace and human rights protection remain inseparable, and we urge renewed international commitment to justice, accountability, and a viable consistency with international law.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Association Maona for Human Rights and Immigration.
We thank the High Commissioner for his report. As the world attempts to reckon with the unimaginable suffering faced by the people of Gaza in the last 2 years and 4 months, we are confronted with the undeniable reality that it is far from over. This is despite the effort to create a narrative of a non-existent peace brokered in October 2025 that allegedly amounted to a ceasefire in which Palestinians continue to be killed, forcefully displaced, and denied the necessities of life, including medicine and food. Between 28th of January and the 11th of February 2026, 109 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces. This is not a ceasefire. This is the normalization of ongoing war crimes and violations of international law. Suffering, grief, displacement, violence, and apartheid are not inherent to the continued existence of Palestine. This is human-made and enforced. The actions carried out by the Israeli army show a concerted and systematic effort to dismantle every provision required to sustain life in the Gaza Strip. We call on this Council and all states to fulfill their legal obligation to ensure accountability for all those who continue to aid and abet crimes against humanity. The world failed to act when the equivalent of an entire classroom of children was killed every day for 2 years. It is time to prove that nobody is above the tenets of international law. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Medical Aid for Palestine, intervention by video.
Mr. High Commissioner, despite the October 2025 ceasefire agreement, the Israeli authorities and military continue to create and maintain conditions unfit to sustain human life in Gaza. The healthcare system has been systematically dismantled and left unable to rebuild or operate because of Israel's deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid and weaponizing deprivation against people. In the West Bank also, Israeli authorities continue to adopt measures that entrench and consolidate annexation. At the same time, settler attacks carried out under the watchful eye of Israeli forces and with impunity have more than tripled since 2021, becoming a leading driver of forced displacement. Mr. High Commissioner, your report warns of ethnic cleansing in the occupied Palestinian territory. What we are witnessing is a systematic assault on Palestinian survival and existence. Impunity fuels further atrocities. States must urgently impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel, take measures to put an end to Israel's genocide in Gaza and unlawful occupation, and hold those responsible for violating international law to account, and also protecting principled humanitarian action. Without enforcement, international law offers no protection, and without accountability, Israeli oppression will endure. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Turo Law Center, the Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust, intervention by video.
UN High Commissioner Türk, you've given a masterclass on unaccountability. There's nothing in your report about accountability for your go-to International Criminal Court, whose top prosecutor, Karim Khan, is both an alleged serial rapist and its highest paid employee. Nothing about the ICC pretending Khan's decisions, criminalizing Jewish self-defense, are untainted by Khan's frantic efforts to distract from his personal scandals. Nothing about accountability for your Human Rights Office that provides material support for Rapporteur Albanese and former and current commissioners of inquiry, Pillay, Sidati, and Kotari, who all covered up Palestinian use of rape as a weapon of war and traffic in blatant anti-Semitism.
I noticed that derogatory, insulting, and inflammatory remarks have been made, as well as those directed against specific individuals. This amounts to personal attacks against these individuals and is not acceptable in our discussion. And I trust this is the view of the Council as a whole, as we have discussed before. Everyone has the right to express their views, but this should remain within the appropriate framework, terminology, and decorum of the United Nations and this Council, as I trust we all in this room observe and respect. The language used by the speaker cannot be allowed, as it has exceeded the limits of tolerance and respect within the framework of the Council, which we all in this room hold to. I now give the floor to the representative of the International Federation of Journalists. It being absent, I now give the floor to the Palestinian Return Center Limited, intervention by video.
Mr. President, the Palestinian Return Center welcomes the High Commissioner's report submitted pursuant to Resolution 58-2. The widespread destruction and mass displacement documented are not random. They are part of a long-standing system of apartheid and institutionalized domination. At the heart of this crisis is the continued denial of the right of return. This legal root cause remains unaddressed, fueling decades of protracted displacement. Today, we witness what can only be described as a demographic engineering, an attempt to force Palestinians out while simultaneously undermining UNRWA to liquidate the refugee issue to block any future return. Ongoing displacement in Gaza and the West Bank cannot be stopped without a political and legal commitment to the right of return. Without this, the international community is merely documenting a repeating cycle of dispossession. We urge the Council to establish a clear accountability framework that addresses forcible transfer and the denial of return to protect UNRWA's mandate as an essential safeguard for the refugee right until a just solution is reached. Mr. President, accountability must be monitored, not merely recorded. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies.
Thank you. We thank the High Commissioner for his report, whose findings document grave violations, extensive civilian harm, and a deepening humanitarian catastrophe in a climate of entrenched impunity. We must name what is occurring. The UNCOI and Special Rapporteur on OPT have both concluded that Israel is committing genocide. The High Commissioner's report documents conditions increasingly incompatible with Palestinians' continued existence as a group in Gaza and confirms that famine is the direct result of Israeli government's actions. The ICJ found sufficient plausibility to order provisional measures which Israel has not complied with. This Council cannot respond with language calibrated not to disturb. We are equally alarmed by the accelerating destruction of any prospect for Palestinian self-determination in the West Bank. Israel's systemic use of force, mass demolitions, and settler violence amount to apartheid, and Israeli practices constitute an accelerating effort to consolidate annexation. Israeli cabinet decisions early 2026 have deepened this further, expanding settlement, extending military enforcement into areas A and B, and stripping Palestinian planning authority, rendering what remains of the Oslo framework functionally inoperative. We stress the binding force of the ICJ provisional measures, the obligations under a Genocide Convention, and the October 2025 advisory opinion obliging all states not to recognize, aid, or assist the unlawful occupation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Egypt Peace for Development and Human Rights, intervention by video.
السيد الرئيس، نرحب بتقرير المفوض السامي بشأن حالة حقوق الإنسان في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة بما فيها القدس الشرقية وما ورد به من أنماط مقلقة لانتهاكات جسيمة للقانون الدولي الإنساني خلال الفترة المشمولة بالتقرير. تشير النتائج إلى استمرار سقوط أعداد كبيرة من المدنيين نتيجة ممارسات قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، فضلا عن تدمير واسع للبنية التحتية المدنية، إلى جانب التهجير القسري واتساع نطاق القيود المفروضة على وصول المساعدات الإنسانية. وفي تأكيد على استمرار هذه الأنماط بعد انتهاء الفترة المشمولة بالتقرير، أسفرت هجمات شنتها قوات الاحتلال في مناطق متفرقة من قطاع غزة بتاريخ 4 فبراير 2026 عن مقتل 19 مدنيا بينهم 8 أطفال و3 نساء ومزعف، رغم الإعلان عن وقف إطلاق النار. وفي الضفة الغربية تواصل سلطات الاحتلال سياسات التوسع الاستيطاني وما يرتبط بها من مصادرة للأراضي والاستخدام المفرط للقوة وهدم الممتلكات. إن هذه الوقائع تؤكد ضرورة التحرك العادل لدعم المساءلة وضمان احترام القانون الدولي وتهيئة بيئة مواتية لاستئناف عملية سياسية جادة تفضي إلى سلام عادل وقائم على حل الدولتين. بما يحقق الأمن والاستقرار لجميع شعوب المنطقة. شكرا سيادة الرئيس.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of the International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you. The High Commissioner's report documents systemic destruction, mass civilian deaths, and blocked aid in Gaza, grave breaches of international law amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. In Gaza, starvation has been weaponized, homes and shelters bombed, and humanitarian workers killed. This is a deliberate strategy to dismantle society and forcibly displace the population. In the West Bank, killings, torture, demolitions, and forced displacement persist with impunity. All of this coincides with Israel's ongoing daily attacks and occupation in Lebanon and Syria, further confirming that these actions form part of a broader aggressive policy. Indeed, they constitute a threat to international peace and security and require decisive measures to deter such aggressive practices. These crimes, left unpunished, threaten the very foundations of the international system. When an entire society can be destroyed without consequences, the credibility of international law collapses. Palestine has become the moment the rules-based order lost its meaning. We call for immediate action to end these violations and atrocities, ensure humanitarian access, and secure accountability through independent mechanisms. International law cannot be selective. Without justice, it loses its legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate. I now give the floor back to the High Commissioner for Human Rights for his concluding remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and I would also like to share with you in response a number of concluding observations, but also respond to the questions that have been raised. And I have to say I've been now, I think, for the 4th year in discussions and in an interactive dialogue on the occupied Palestinian territory. And for the first time, I feel that what we see and hear from you are very clear messages. They are messages about making sure that the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza is addressed. That's a very, very clear message. It means that everything has to be done to ensure that there's unhindered access to humanitarian aid. Another very clear message that I hear is around the absolute importance of respect for international law. And frankly, when it comes to international law, that has been absolutely clear because you have not only provisional measures adopted by the International Court of Justice, but also advisory opinions offered by the International Court of Justice that talk about the obligations to end the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. That respect for international law is, and the message that I also hear from all of you is loud and clear. The other message that I hear is about the deteriorating situation in the West Bank. That we have not only documented, but that we have also heard in terms of the various decisions that are being taken as we speak. That indeed, and the de facto annexation that is happening, is extremely dangerous and one that would in effect undermine the right of Palestinians to self-determination and to a two-state solution. And indeed, what I hear also is not only the New York Declaration and the respect for it, but also the fact that there needs to be measures taken to realize the two-state solution. I also hear a very clear call for accountability of all the violations that have occurred, irrespective of the perpetrators. And that sense of accountability is both at the domestic levels, it's at the international level, and there needs to be respect for it. Because we know that if you are not going to have any of this accountability, we are going to continue the bloodshed that we currently see. Another message that I hear loud and clear is that a ceasefire is a ceasefire and it needs to be respected. It cannot be continued killings as we've witnessed them as we speak, and it needs to be made sure that the various mechanisms that have been established under the Security Council resolution last year that validated the ceasefire that these are bound by international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And it is very important that in these efforts, in these various phases of the implementation, that international law is the guiding light, including the right of Palestinians to self-determination. And then, and that's very important as well, the respect for the international institutions themselves. When it comes, for example, to the demolition of an UNRWA compound in East Jerusalem, this is a warning signal for everyone, because if UN premises are destroyed in the way that they are or demolished, it gives us a sign that this could eventually happen to others, as it has been done. And as you know, many of the humanitarian workers have been affected, many were killed, including their families. And we have also seen the attempts when it comes to non-governmental organizations working in Gaza, that they are no longer allowed to work there. But that immediately has an impact on the humanitarian situation. So all of this needs to be again, the message that I heard from you was loud and clear in terms of respect, again, for international law. And I really hope that we can find a way forward with the clear and loud message that has come from this Council to find a way forward and a way towards peace, and to ensure that it is built on the international legal framework and the framing of it through international law by the court, by the highest court in the world, by the principles of international humanitarian law and the principles of international human rights law, and that this is the guide for the way forward. And again, thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank the High Commissioner for his participation, for his briefing. We will now take on a short technical break before we hold the enhanced interactive dialogue on the report of the Commission of Human Rights in South Sudan. Excellencies, distinguished participants, colleagues, we will now start the enhanced interactive dialogue on the report of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan pursuant to Council Resolution 58/1. It is my honor to welcome Mr. Volker Türk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is my further honor to welcome our distinguished presenters, His Excellency Honorable Michael Makuei-Lueth, Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs of South Sudan, Ms. Yasmin Suka, Chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, Mr. Barney Afako, Member of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, Mr. Carlos Castresana Fernandez, Member of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, Ms. Memory Bandera, Representative of Civil Society. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. And I now invite the High Commissioner for Human Rights to make an opening statement for this enhanced interactive dialogue. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished delegates. I am extremely concerned about the human rights situation in South Sudan. This is one of the world's forgotten crises. We are at a dangerous point when rising violence is combined with deepening uncertainty over South Sudan's political trajectory as the peace agreement comes under severe strain. In the past 3 months, both government and opposition forces and their allied militias have launched attacks on residential areas in Upper Nile, Jonglei, Unity, Central Equatoria, Western Bar, Al-Ghazal, Western Equatoria, and Warab states. In northern Jonglei, more than 280,000 people fled as their homes, schools, and healthcare facilities came under fire. January saw a further deterioration. My office documented that 189 civilians were killed and many more injured, as human rights violations and abuses surged by 45% compared with December. Civilians are bearing the brunt of a spike in indiscriminate attacks, including aerial bombardments, deliberate killings, abductions, and conflict-related sexual violence. These attacks raise serious concerns under international law. I was horrified to learn about an attack earlier this week by government forces and allied militia on a village in Ayod County, Jonglei State. Witnesses told my colleagues that troops ordered residents to gather and then opened fire on the crowd, killing 21 unarmed civilians, including women and children. Military discipline appears to have collapsed in both government and opposition forces in Jonglei and eastern Equatoria, where troops have demonstrated a near total disregard for civilian protection. The recent escalation comes against the backdrop of rising tensions and civilian deaths throughout 2025. My office recorded an increase of 40% in the number of people killed and injured last year to more than 5,100 compared with 2024. Tragically, 2 UN staff members were among those killed, which is completely unacceptable. Our team has monitored more 250 individual cases of women and girls who suffered conflict-related sexual violence. The true figures are likely much higher. We also documented a disturbing increase to 550 in the number of civilians abducted by opposition forces and their allies in 2025. Distinguished delegates, rising tensions are characterized by hate speech and incitement to violence targeting entire communities and ethnic groups. In one audio recording authenticated by the UN mission, a senior military official urged his forces to spare no lives and to destroy civilian homes, livestock, and property. Let me be clear. Acts of hate speech and incitement to violence may amount to international crimes. In the context of armed conflict, those risks become particularly acute. Those responsible for such crimes may be prosecuted under international law. My office has also documented increased threats to civic space. The National Security Service censors the media, monitors civil society activities, intimidates journalists and political activists, and targets human rights defenders and activists who speak out. We documented 27 incidents of intimidation and arbitrary arrest of journalists, civil society actors, and human rights defenders throughout the year, affecting 62 people, including 28 women. Some were held for weeks before being granted bail. Others were released without charge within hours. Open civic space is essential to inclusive constitution building and transitional justice, and for free, fair, credible, and inclusive elections to be held as scheduled in December 2026. Distinguished delegates, sustainable peace cannot be achieved without accountability for serious violations and abuses. That accountability must be owned and driven by national authorities in order to restore confidence in institutions, affirm the rights of victims, and prevent cycles of repeated violence. International efforts cannot replace the primary responsibility of the state. The government has taken some important steps towards implementing its commitments, including the adoption of laws establishing the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing and the Compensation and Reparation Authority. The task ahead is to translate these frameworks into fully functioning institutions that deliver truth, justice, and reparations for victims and survivors. Moving forward with the establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan will be essential to ensure accountability and redress to victims. This is long overdue. Mr. President, the dire humanitarian situation in South Sudan and the war across the border are intrinsically linked to rising insecurity and wider human rights violations and abuses. More than 10 million people require humanitarian assistance, including 7.5 million facing food insecurity. The arrival of more than 1.3 million refugees and returnees from Sudan and the disruption of trade puts even more pressure on very limited resources. But South Sudan is extremely dangerous for humanitarian workers. There were 350 attacks on staff and facilities in 2025, up by more than a third from the previous year. The humanitarian crisis will not be solved without addressing insecurity and weak governance. And I urge the government to remove physical and bureaucratic obstacles to access and to invest in resilience and recovery. Mr. President, human rights monitoring provides a warning signal. That system is flashing red for South Sudan. We need urgent action to preserve the peace agreement and prevent fragmentation and cycles of retaliation that could herald a return to all-out civil war. I call for an immediate halt to all hostilities and reiterate the need for all parties to the conflict to abide by international human rights and international humanitarian law. I urge them to recommit to inclusive dialogue and implement the peace agreement. I call for accountability for serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including conflict-related sexual violence. And I urge political and military leaders to reject ethnic incitement, end the mobilization of communities along ethnic lines, and uphold their obligation to prevent ethnic-based violence. The situation in South Sudan demands the full attention of the international community, sustained monitoring, and robust advocacy to ensure that the rights, dignity and safety of civilians are at the center of national and international approaches. I reiterate my call on the international community to intensify its engagement and to support the people of South Sudan in their efforts towards healing and long-term stability. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Honorable Michael Makwe Lue.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. It is an honor and my pleasure to address this 61st session of the Human Rights Council today. The government of the Republic of South Sudan is fully committed to peace, stability, and implementation of the revitalized agreement. While we acknowledge that challenges exist, we respectfully declare that implementation of the agreement is ongoing despite these challenges, and we strongly reject one-sided narrative that overlooks the substantial progress made under extremely difficult circumstances. Excellencies, the agreement generally mandates the elections that shall be held in accordance with the provisions of the permanent constitution. Since the permanent constitution is not yet attainable before the end of the current transitional period, then the need arises for us to delink the process of permanent constitution making and the population census from the conduct of elections in December 2026. Based on Article 8.4 of the Revitalized Agreement on the Resolution of Conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, the parties signatory to the agreement agreed unanimously to amend some provisions of the agreement to enable the conduct of elections. I would like to take this opportunity to clarify and respond to the allegations of the Commission against the government of South Sudan. The Commission has not been fair and honest in its reports on the human rights situation, political and security development in South Sudan. The Commission has clearly interfered with the implementation of the agreement and supported the splinter breakaway group of the SPLM-AIO. On armed conflict and violence in Western Equatoria, Upper Nile, and Jonglei State, the report of the Commission is clearly biased in support of the relief SPLM-AIO Governor of Western Equatoria State, General Alfred Futuyo Karaba, who was responsible for all the atrocities and human rights violations committed in Western Equatoria State and for his misconduct. On Upper Nile and Jonglei State, the Commission did not give itself time to collect accurate information about the situation in those states. Instead, they relied on social media reports and propaganda as clearly indicated by supplementary information to the report of the Commission dated 27 February 2025, where it relied on what it called confidential records held by the Commission and selected non-confidential sources of information used for the report and additional notes. On forced recruitment of boys and young men, the Commission should verify these testimonies of the alleged recruitment of child soldiers by indicating where and under which SPDF division or commander. On sexual and gender-based violence, the government has set up general court-martials for the military, gender-based violence and juvenile courts in Juba, Malakal, Wau, and other towns, contrary to the reports of the Commission. On the detention of the prosecution of the opposition leaders, it is crystal clear that the Commission did not give itself the least opportunity to learn about the legal system of the Republic of South Sudan. The accused persons were arrested and are being prosecuted at present in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution and the laws of the Republic of South Sudan. On accountability and transitional justice, as a government, we are in the process of establishing the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing and the Compensation and Reparation Authority. As for the hybrid court, we are still waiting for the guidelines from the African Union. In conclusion, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the government of the Republic of South Sudan is urging the Commission to verify its findings with the government before submission to the Human Rights Council for deliberations. The Commission should avoid use of impolite language such as must, the government must, ordering the government in its report. Finally, the government of the Republic of South Sudan appreciates the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the concern and dedication shown towards the people of the government, towards the people and the government. However, we don't see any need for the renewal of the mandate of the Commission, since there are other human rights bodies which are carrying out the same mandate. We urge the Council to shift South Sudan from item 2 to item 10 of the transitional assistance and capacity building. Finally, to conclude, the government reaffirms its readiness to work with the Council, member states, and partners who seek to support our path towards the conduct of elections, sustainable peace, and the rule of law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Yasmin Suka.
Good morning, Mr. President, Excellencies, Member States. I'm joined by my colleagues Bania Farco and Carlos Castrosana Fernandez. At a moment when this Council is consumed by multiple global crises, another war is quietly gathering momentum. South Sudan is sliding towards renewed and potentially catastrophic conflict with serious implications for regional stability. The warning signs are unmistakable. The peace agreement is being deliberately dismantled. Civilians are being targeted, opposition leaders are detained, and external forces are increasingly involved. More than 3 million South Sudanese have been displaced, a 40% increase in 1 year. These are families fleeing aerial bombardment, burnt villages, and targeted ethnic violence. Military campaigns in Jonglei and Upper Nile are driving mass displacement. A commander previously identified by the Commission for Serious Crimes was filmed ordering his forces to kill civilians, sparing no one, not the elderly, not a chicken, not homes. This is not rhetoric. It is incitement to commit mass atrocity crimes. Civilians are treated as legitimate targets based on perceived political affiliation, and collective punishment prevails. Despite public distancing, the government has left him in command, raising grave concerns regarding tolerance and command responsibility. Images have emerged of civilians bound and executed. One witness testified they tied their hands and shot them one by one. The Commission has documented aerial bombardments across 7 of 10 states using improvised incendiary devices. Civilian homes and hospitals, including a Médecins Sans Frontières facility, have been struck, disrupting healthcare for more than 100,000 people. These operations require planning, authorization at senior levels, and engage individual criminal responsibility under international law. Government forces and affiliated actors have forcibly recruited boys and young men in conflict zones in Jonglei. Children have been abducted and killed, some burnt beyond recognition. Sexual violence remains widespread and ethnically targeted. Survivors have told us that they are raped, and they are told because you're a Nuer, or in the case of Nuer women married to Dinka men, the reverse is also true. The consequences are devastating for survivors, for livelihoods, and of course for children born of rape. The cross-border recruitment of South Sudanese youth into Sudan's war, escalating internal mobilization, the opening of an eastern front, and the involvement of regional forces are no longer isolated developments. Taken together, they point to the real prospect of widening regional conflict, one that could draw in neighboring African Union member states and lead to the destabilization of the Horn. In terms of the dismantling of the revitalized peace agreement, the Council has seen this before. In 2016, the peace agreement collapsed with catastrophic consequences. This time around, the deterioration is not accidental. It reflects deliberate political choices. the revitalized peace agreement negotiated under African Union IGAD auspices and guaranteed by the African Union is systematically being dismantled. Power-sharing arrangements are being unilaterally eroded, the abandonment of constitutional reform, the failure to unify and deploy national forces have deepened instability. Persistent non-implementation, including of transitional justice commitments, have directly fueled renewed violence and eroded the trust between parties. Opposition leaders, including the first vice president, have been arrested and prosecuted on charges carrying the death penalty. Riek Machar's prolonged detention, the lack of timely access to counsel, and concerns regarding judicial independence raise serious due process violations. In a fragile power-sharing transition, prosecuting the principal opposition leader risks criminalizing political contestation and further destabilizing the peace framework. Political activists' space is shrinking. Activists face detention and surveillance. Civil society representatives from South Sudan declined to travel to Geneva for fear of reprisals. In this context, of course, rushing elections is unrealistic, and there can be no credible electoral process where civic space is repressed and key leaders remain detained. The continued failure to operationalize the AU-mandated hybrid court emboldens perpetrators and denies victims justice. Commitments to establish the Truth Commission and Reparations Authority also remain unfulfilled, and accountability remains a precondition for sustainable peace. Our report, of course, underscores that this is not only a political crisis, but a struggle over resource capture. Grand corruption has siphoned public revenues to elites, hollowed out state institutions, and deepened the influence of politically connected networks, including companies in oil revenues that have been generated, and yet citizens remain in deprivation. Impunity doesn't follow conflict, it sustains it, and corruption fuels that engine through the capture of state institutions for political survival.
Finish early. All right, thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Memory Bandera. The speaking time slot is 5 minutes.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, my name is Memory Bandera. I am the Director of Programs and Administration at Defend Defenders, which is the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project, a regional NGO based in Uganda. We were established in 2005 to strengthen the work of human rights defenders throughout the Eastern Horn of Africa sub-region. I have been working on South Sudan and with South Sudanese since before independence, but I'm not a South Sudanese. I am speaking here today on behalf of South Sudanese civil society. Several individuals initially invited to speak expressed their concerns that they were not able to speak because of possible repercussions. This speaks volumes about the country's human rights situation. I take this opportunity to mention the obligation of states to prevent reprisals against those engaging with UN human rights bodies and mechanisms. Excellencies, this is the most dangerous time since the revitalized peace agreement was signed in 2018. This leads us to reflect on the tremendous contrast between the hopes and pride felt in 2011 when South Sudan was officially born as Africa's youngest nation, and the situation now, which is marked by multiple crises, widespread violence, near-complete impunity for violations, deep frustration at the multiple extensions of the transitional period, and fears for upcoming elections. Civic space has been squeezed with sweeping restrictions and threats against independent actors, human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, media professionals, and citizens who simply express their opinion about the way their country is ruled. Despite the severe risks and threats it faces, Civil society continues to document violations, advocate for reforms, monitor implementation or lack thereof of the peace agreement, and push for accountability. In this regard, we deplore the non-operationalization of the three transnational justice mechanisms envisioned under Chapter 5 of the Peace Agreement. I want to salute the South Sudanese human rights defenders. They provide regional mechanisms and international community with both analysis of patterns of violations and early warning analysis, civic space restrictions, attacks on defenders, identity-based incitement, and election period repression. Human rights defenders and their networks and coalitions are key to gather, channel, and frame relevant information as early warning indicators. As shown in Against All Odds, a report that Defend Defenders published with South Sudanese Human Rights Defenders Network late 2023, the situation of women human rights defenders is even more challenging. They face formidable challenges, including risk of sexual violence, but are showing resilience, determination, and solidarity. Excellencies, Mr. President, let me mention, however, a reason for hope. Despite the international context, including attacks on multilateralism, the UN's financial crisis, and a chronically underfunded UN human rights pillar, now disproportionately affected by UN 80, and growing cynicism about transactional politics, human rights defenders still believe in this council. They still come to Geneva, they sign on to initiatives, including those like this year's civil society letter calling for the extension of the Commission's mandate, and try to break the vicious cycle, lack of accountability, reputation of violations, more impunity, more violations. I end with a plea to reprioritize South Sudan. At this session, states should support the Commission, extend its mandate, and ensure adequate funding and staffing. They should enhance the Council's level of attention, including by reinstating debates on South Sudan at September sessions, and exercise the Council's prevention mandate, standing ready to respond to any further deterioration through a special session, an urgent debate, and urgent inquiries, and additional resources for the Commission. Please match the eagerness of South Sudanese defenders and civil society to see international community involved in their country with steadfast action by this Council. Heed their call, don't betray them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the presenters and to make comments on their statements. I wish to remind you that the speaking time is 1 minute and 30 seconds for all. The list of speakers is now closed. I would like to recall that the duration of interactive dialogues is 1 hour and 30 minutes. If time permits, additional delegations will be able to speak. With this understanding, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states, I thank the High Commissioner and the Commission for their reports on the situation of human rights in South Sudan. Intensifying violence across South Sudan is deepening an already dire humanitarian situation, placing civilians at heightened risk and driving increased displacement, food insecurity, and protection needs. Immediate action is necessary to address the prevalent conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Widespread gross human rights violations are driven by deepened impunity as the 2018 peace agreement continues to be undermined. The report clearly outlines that avoiding a return to fully fledged civil war in South Sudan depends on urgently dismantling entrenched impunity, ending the capture and militarization of state institutions and the economy by political and military elites, and by advancing a legitimate inclusive political order through genuine and inclusive political dialogue. We encourage continued engagement between the government of South Sudan and the Commission to implement the recommendations made in the report. In this regard, the work of the Commission remains ever more important. We urge all states to support the mandate renewal. In conclusion, I ask what can partners do to ensure renewed regional and international engagement to ensure a return to inclusive transition. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, Minister, Commissioners, distinguished panelists, we thank you for your report, Commissioners, and appreciate the cooperation of the government of South Sudan. The EU is deeply concerned by the deteriorating security, humanitarian and human rights situation, especially in Jonglei State. We urgently call on all parties to halt violence. A ceasefire, dialogue and meaningful re-engagement with the 2018 revitalized peace agreement is the only guarantee for peace and stability. We are deeply concerned by the human rights violations outlined in your report, including increasing limitations on civic space. We urge South Sudan to combat impunity and ensure accountability. The collecting of evidence remains essential. We also call on South Sudan to combat corruption and financial mismanagement. We are alarmed by the ongoing mass displacement of civilians and call for humanitarian access and full adherence to IHL. The South Sudanese authorities should make every effort to protect civilians. The EU remains committed to supporting the peace process, once again calls for the immediate release of all political detainees, including the first Vice President, Dr. Machar. All parties must work together to ensure the full implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. Commissioners, what steps can the international community take to support the de-escalation in Jonglei State and across South Sudan? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya on behalf of Group of African States.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the African Group. The African Group reaffirms its 31st stand in solidarity with the people of South Sudan as they navigate the final stages of the transitional period towards sustainable peace and democratic governance. We welcome the government's continued commitment to implement the revitalized agreement as the only viable path towards stability, as it was declared by the recent high-level meeting of the AUC5 at the margins of AU Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The African Group notes with encouragement the significant steps taken by the government towards the December 2026 elections, defining the census and certain constitutional requirements, as well as to engage constructively with the holdout groups, non-signatories of the revitalized agreement, through a Tumaini initiative under the mediation of Kenya in Nairobi, with the aim to make the elections and peace inclusive. This milestone demonstrates the political will necessary to transition towards permanent democratic governance in the country. The African Group emphasizes the international community.
May I ask the speaker to slow down a little bit on behalf of the interpreters? Thank you. The interpreters requested that if you could slow down, they could interpret you better.
My apologies. The African Group notes with encouragement the significant steps taken by the government towards December 26 elections, deferring the census and certain constitutional requirements, as well as to engage constructively with holdout groups, non-signatories of the revitalized agreement through Tumaini initiative under the mediation of Kenya in Nairobi, with the aim to make elections and peace inclusive. This milestone demonstrates the political will necessary to transition towards permanent democratic governance in the country. The African Group emphasizes international community's role must be one of constructive solidarity with the South Sudan and calls for shift from punitive approaches under Item 2 towards technical assistance and capacity building under Item 10. Strengthening South Sudan's domestic judicial institutions and supporting unification of forces are the most effective ways to ensure long-term human rights protection. In conclusion, the African Group urges the Council and the international partners to provide the resources required to complete the transitional roadmap. Let us prioritize engagement that empowers South Sudanese institutions to deliver peace and justice their people deserve. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We align with the statement made by the European Union. We are gravely concerned about the human rights situation in South Sudan, which has deteriorated even further due to and following the clashes in Nasir in March 2025. The ensuing intensified conflict and violence, the entrenched impunity and the elite capture of public resources is having a devastating effect on civilians and exacerbates an increasingly dire humanitarian situation. We are abhorred by the persistent pattern of grave violations against children and sexual and gender-based violence. Following the events in March, the authorities have effectively sidelined the opposition through the replacement of ministers and senior military, arrests, detentions and criminal proceedings. These and other violations of the 2018 Revitalize Agreement have brought its implementation to a standstill. The situation is both unacceptable and untenable. The people of South Sudan deserve full respect for and protection of their human rights, as well as lasting peace and security. Mr. Commissioner, what steps can the international community take to elevate global attention to the crisis in South Sudan so as to foster the political will necessary for all parties to resume negotiations and fully implement the Revitalize Agreement? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I deliver, as you said, this statement on behalf of the core group for South Sudan, Albania, Norway, Ireland and the UK. We thank the Commissioners for their report. Its findings depict a grave deterioration in South Sudan's human rights and security situation throughout 2025. We are deeply concerned by evidence of renewed large-scale conflict, unprecedented aerial bombardments in multiple states, mass displacement and the continued targeting of civilians. The forced recruitment of boys and young men and the widespread use of sexual violence by all parties are particularly alarming. The detentions and prosecutions of opposition leaders, alongside interference in the judiciary and attempts to undermine the revitalised agreement, erode constitutional order and threaten further instability. Such actions are incompatible with credible, peaceful and inclusive elections in 2026. The report makes clear that transparency, resourcing and genuine political will remain lacking when it comes to establishing transitional justice institutions. The hybrid court in particular is urgently needed to address entrenched impunity. The revitalised agreement continues to provide the only current basis for transitional government legitimacy. We urge all parties to cease hostilities, ensure humanitarian access and uphold international law. The Commission's mandate remains indispensable and must be renewed in full this session. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Uganda aligns with the statement of the African Group. Uganda continues to closely monitor with interest the implementation of the Revitalize Agreement as one of the guarantors and long-standing friendly neighbor of South Sudan. We firmly believe that full restoration of peace, stability, constitutionalism and democracy in South Sudan lies within the tenets of the Revitalize Agreement, as was reaffirmed recently at the high-level summit of the African Union in Addis Ababa. In this regard, we welcome every effort by the government of South Sudan to ensure peaceful and inclusive elections targeted for December 2026. We reiterate the importance of ensuring democratic processes, including elections, are held in a conducive environment geared towards restoring peace and stability. Peace, stability, national reconciliation, and human rights are intrinsically linked. As this Council demands for certain civil and political rights, therefore, we should be mindful of the environment in which they will be held. We support the request to the Council to move this enhanced dialogue from Agenda Item 2 to Agenda Item 10 to enhance the capacity as requested. We further call on the international community to continue the support and work with the government of South Sudan and the region for sustainable peace, security, and development of the country. Uganda is committed to continue playing its part bilaterally and through regional frameworks like IGAD. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Angola aligns itself with the African Group statement. Angola reaffirms its strong commitment to peace and regional stability as essential foundations for the promotion and protection of human rights. We believe that there are no human rights without peace, nor sustainable peace without inclusive development. promoting a culture of peace, human rights education, and the meaningful participation of women and youth results a cross-cutting priority of our action at the national, regional and international levels. We call upon all parties in South Sudan to demonstrate renewed commitment to the full implementation of the revitalized peace agreement, which remains the cornerstone for lasting stability, reconciliation, and the protection of the rights of all citizens. Angola further stresses the importance of African solutions to African problems, underscoring the central role of regional and continental mechanisms in supporting sustainable and locally owned process. I thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of UNICEF.
Mr. President, UNICEF welcomes the report of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan and thanks the Commission for its continued work. Children in South Sudan continue to face grave protection risks. Violence in Jonglei and parts of Unity State has displaced many families and increased children's exposure to recruitment and use by armed actors, abduction, killing and maiming, and rape and other forms of sexual violence. Reports indicate that boys as young as 13 are being recruited and used by parties. Girls face heightened risk of sexual violence, child marriage, sexual exploitation, and other forms of gender-based violence. This protection crisis is compounded by displacement and insecurity, which result in a greater disruption of access to essential services. Many children cannot safely access healthcare, nutrition support, education, clean water and sanitation or protection services. Child protection responses, including mental health and psychosocial support, remain overstretched. UNICEF welcomes the government's renewal of its comprehensive action plan to end and prevent the 6 grave violations against children and urges all parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian and human rights law, prevent and end violations, and ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access. Children in South Sudan cannot wait. Their rights, dignity, and future must remain at the center of all efforts towards peace and recovery. Thank you.
I now call on the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa aligns with the African Group and commends South Sudan for its cooperation with the Commission. We acknowledge the Commission's engagement with the AU, demonstrating the importance of complementarity and subsidiarity with regional processes. My delegation is concerned about the deteriorating security situation and intensifying violence and calls for de-escalation and an immediate ceasefire. The innocent, particularly women and children, continue to bear the brunt and indeed are the face of the conflict, which demands accountability and an end to impunity that enables the perpetration of grave crimes. The revitalized agreement, which remains the paramount framework for resolving the conflict, must therefore be restored and fully implemented. As such, inclusive dialogue must be prioritized to address any outstanding issues. The transitional justice institutions envisaged under Chapter 5 of the agreement, including the Truth Commission and the Compensation Authority, must be properly resourced and operationalized. Together with the hybrid court, these measures are at the very core of securing the lasting peace and justice which the people of South Sudan rightly deserve. As a guarantor of the agreement, South Africa will continue to stand with South Sudan to silence the guns once and for all. In so doing, we welcome the outcome of the recent C5 meeting which we chair, and we appeal to the international community to continue supporting South Sudan in this process. I thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka takes note with appreciation South Sudan's constructive engagement with this Council, including under Agenda Item 10. We also welcome the progressive developments in South Sudan in advancing promotion and protection of human rights. Mr. President, Sri Lanka emphasizes that any external effort at improving the human rights situation in a country should be guided by mutual cooperation and dialogue. In contrast, any initiative and mechanism established without the consent of the country concerned would be both unhelpful and counterproductive. Further, such initiatives undermine the spirit of cooperation required for the promotion and protection of human rights. In conclusion, Sri Lanka calls on the international community and the Council to extend support for South Sudan's efforts based on national priorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. We acknowledge South Sudan's engagement with the Office of the High Commissioner, the Commission on Human Rights in Sudan, UNMISS, as well as relevant regional mechanisms in place. Progress and development, including the strengthening of national institutions and initiatives aimed at enhancing social and economic resilience, reflects South Sudan's ongoing commitment to building a more stable and inclusive society. These developments will need continued support. We do not believe it is constructive to maintain two separate mechanisms on the country. South Sudan has demonstrated full cooperation with relevant partners. What is now required is a strengthened focused technical cooperation that supports national capacity building. Punitive mechanisms have not yielded positive outcomes. Eritrea reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with the people of South Sudan as they continue their journey toward a peaceful and stable future. We encourage continued collaboration and support that respects South Sudan's sovereignty and fosters national ownership of the peace and development processes that are in place in the country. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Somalia aligned itself with statement delivered by the African Group. The Federal Republic of Somalia takes note of the report of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan and thanks the High Commissioner thanks the Commission for its continued work and engagement. We welcome the continued commitment to implementation of the refacilitated peace agreement and the note of the important regional support, including the engagement of the African Union C5, including the dialogue, inclusive dialogue, particularly through the Tumiani initiative, an essential broadening peace, broadening participation and strengthening reconciliation. Somalia underscored durable peace and protection of human rights depending on strengthening national institutions, including effective judicial mechanism and unified forces, and enhancing accountability and rule of law. We call on the international community to support the government of South Sudan with the capacity building and technical assistance to strengthen its national human rights institutions. Mr. President, Somalia reaffirms its solidarity with the people of South Sudan, and thank you. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Mr. President, Albania aligned with the joint statement of core groups on South Sudan resolution and reiterated its strong commitment as a member of this group to advancing human rights, accountability, and sustainable peace in South Sudan. We thank the members of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan for their continued dedication and professionalism in fulfilling their mandate. The situation in South Sudan has deteriorated further. Reports of intensified hostility across several states, continuous air bombardment in populated areas, widespread displacement, and grave violation against civilians underscore the fragility of the peace process and the urgent need for preventive action. It warned that both the implementation of the revitalized agreement and the conduct of the elections scheduled for December 2026 are at serious risk. Mr. President, Albania remains concerned by the persistent lack of accountability for past and ongoing violence and abuses. In this context, the work of the Commission remains indispensable. At the same time, we call on the government to fulfill the revitalized peace agreement, upholds its international human rights obligation, protect civilians, ensure humanitarian access, and create the conditions necessary for free, fair, and inclusive election. My country firmly supports the renewal of the Commission mandate in full. I thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Mr. President, the Republic of Kenya aligns with the statement delivered by the African Group. We have taken note of the report, which provides critical insights into the severe human rights challenges that have intensified across South Sudan in 2025, including the renewed clashes in the states such as Western Equatoria, Upper Nile, Jonglei, widespread airstrike affecting civilian areas, forced recruitment of youth, sexual and gender-based violence, and a sharp rise in internal displacement of up to 3.5 million people. These troubling developments underscores the urgent need for renewed commitment to the peace process and the protection of civilian lives. In our role as the IGAD guarantor and the initiator of the Tumaini Initiative, we remain dedicated to impartial facilitation of dialogue and mediation. South Sudan faces a pivotal moment requiring renewed focus, collective resolve, strengthened partnership, and sustained vigilance from all parties today in order to prevent a return to widespread conflict and enable a stable transition. As the South Sudan approaches the December 2026 election, inclusive dialogue is paramount. A sustainable ceasefire and further humanitarian access, effective civilian protection, and confidence-building process measures, constitutional review, and a credible national consensus, as contained in the Tumaini Initiative, are elements that remain essential preconditions towards concluding the transitional period with legitimacy. We urge this Council to support ongoing initiatives aligned with the just concluded 39th AU Summit commitment to strengthen the African peace and security architecture and expand the AU Peace Fund in order to consolidate efforts within AU IGAD-led process. Kenya stands solidarity with the Sudanese people in enduring aspiration for peace and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of UN Women.
Thank you, Mr. President. UN Women thanks the Commission for its work. South Sudan stands at a critical juncture. Political fragmentation, ceasefire violations, and stalled implementation of the revitalized peace agreement continue to undermine human rights, accountability, and prospects for sustainable peace. Amidst this deteriorating human rights situation, women and girls are disproportionately affected. Conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, abduction, and sexual exploitation, remains widespread and systematic, marked by impunity. Women's participation in political and peace processes remains critically low, falling well below the agreed 35% quota, which women advocated for in the revitalized peace agreement. The delay in adopting the second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security further weakens prevention, protection, and accountability mechanisms when they are most urgently needed. The dire humanitarian situation places immense strain on already fragile systems and exposes women and girls to heightened risks of violence, exploitation, and deprivation. UN Women underscores the urgent need for the full, timely, and inclusive implementation of the revitalized peace agreement and remains committed to working with all stakeholders to advance gender equality, peace, and human rights for all in South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, we thank the Commission for your report, and we agree with you it paints a stark and troubling picture. The suffering endured by the people of South Sudan is indefensible. As the High Commissioner said, the warning light is flashing red. We are seeing renewed conflict, indiscriminate aerial bombardment, forced recruitment, and systematic sexual violence as a weapon of war. Communities are burned from their homes, children abducted, and humanitarian access obstructed as famine risks grow. This is not the path of a country on the way to meaningful elections. We condemn the 21st of February killing of civilians in Pankur and remind the transitional government that such attacks may constitute war crimes. Full investigations and accountability are essential. We remain gravely concerned by politically motivated detentions and prosecutions of opposition leaders. Attempts to amend the peace agreement risk fatally undermining it and only push South Sudan back towards war. The transitional government's failure to establish the hybrid court leaves victims without justice and perpetrators emboldened. The UK stands with the people of South Sudan. We will continue to press for accountability, protect civic space, and support regional efforts to prevent further atrocities. Commissioners, what should the international community prioritise to help reduce harm to civilians? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malawi.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Malawi aligns with the statement of the African Group, and we thank the Commission for this report. We commend South Sudan for the continued cooperation with the Commission and all efforts that are being made towards sustainable peace and nation building for the country. We remain deeply concerned by continued violence and suffering of civilians, particularly women and children. There is urgent need to de-escalate the situation and renewed political commitment. We therefore recall the position of the African Union, including the recent statement by the AUC5, which reaffirmed the centrality of the revitalized peace agreement and the need for dialogue, restraint, and cooperation among South Sudanese parties. We echo the AU's call for all actors to recommit to the peace process and to refrain from actions that further undermine trust and stability. Malawi underscores that sustainable peace in South Sudan cannot be achieved without respect for human rights, the rule of law, and accountability. In this regard, we urge for the speedy establishment of transitional justice mechanisms such as the hybrid court. We further urge the importance of protecting civilians in the country. Malawi believes that this Council has a responsibility to support regional efforts, reinforce prevention, and remain engaged in a manner that complements the efforts of the AU and IGAD. We encourage continued cooperation with the government of South Sudan, regional bodies, and international partners to restore confidence in the transition and to place the welfare of the people of South Sudan at the center. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan.
السيد الرئيس السودان ينضم إلى البيان المقدم من المجموعة الأفريقية ويرحب بوفد جنوب السودان الشقيق بقيادة معالي وزير العدل والشؤون الدستورية مولانا مايكل ماكوي لويث. إننا نرحب بالتقدم في تنفيذ بنود الاتفاق المنشط للسلام بجنوب السودان بما في ذلك التطورات التشريعية والمؤسسية، وندعو إلى مواصلة تنفيذه رغم التحديات المتعددة التي تواجه جنوب السودان الشقيق، ونحث المجتمع الدولي على دعم ذلك وإرسال الرسائل التي تساعد جنوب السودان للوفاء بالالتزامات الواردة في ذلك الاتفاق. ونشدد هنا أيضا على دور الإيجاد والاتحاد الأفريقي فيما يلي الإشارات للآثار السالبة للأوضاع الأمنية الجارية الآن في السودان وأثرها على الأوضاع في جنوب السودان الشقيق، فهذه حقيقة ماثلة في سياق الروابط المتعددة التي تربط بين البلدين الشقيقين. السودان يؤكد على سيادة جنوب السودان وحقه الكامل في اختيار وتحديد السياسات المناسبة التي تستجيب للاحتياجات الماثلة فيه، وندعو المجتمع الدولي لتقديم الدعم الإنساني والتنموي لجنوب السودان بموجب البند العاشر، وكذلك الدعم الفني في مجالات حقوق الإنسان كافة. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rwanda aligns with the statement delivered by Kenya on behalf of the Africa Group. We take note of the Commission's report. We welcome the government of South Sudan's cooperation and the support provided by the United Nations mission in South Sudan. Rwanda remains concerned by the security and humanitarian situation in South Sudan, including reports of violation affecting civilians, as well as allegations of ethnico-motivated attacks and displacement. Rwanda encourages the full and inclusive implementation of the revitalized agreement as the agreed framework for restoring constitutional order, advancing reconciliation, and strengthening accountable institutions. We call for the operationalization of the transitional justice institution envisioned in the revitalized agreement. In conclusion, Mr. President, we urge the international community to support the African Union processes aimed at advancing the Republic of South Sudan's pursuit of lasting peace, including through prevention-oriented engagement and support of humanitarian access. I thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
السيد الرئيس، اطلعت بعثة بلادي على التقرير وأخذت علما بما جاء فيه. إن بلادي تقدر جهود حكومة جنوب السودان الرامية إلى تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان على الرغم من التحديات والصعوبات التي تواجهها، ونشكر لها تعاونها مع الجهات الفاعلة الإقليمية والدولية وتدعوها لمواصلة تلك الجهود. كما تؤكد بعثة بلادي على أهمية المساعي والجهود لإحلال السلام بما يعزز من حماية واحترام حقوق الإنسان وكل ما من شأنه تحقيق أمن وسلامة جنوب السودان، وتؤكد على أهمية التواصل والتنسيق مع المجتمع الدولي والاستمرار في لعب دور بناء في تعزيز الحوار في مجال حقوق الإنسان. وفي هذا الصدد السيد الرئيس، نحث المجتمع الدولي على مواصلة تقديم الدعم الفني والتقني وبناء القدرات اللازمة لجنوب السودان واحترام رغبته كدولة معنية حول أفضل الآليات اللازمة لتوفير المساعدة الفنية إليها في مجال حقوق الإنسان. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of North Macedonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner and the Commission on Human Rights for its detailed reporting on the situation in South Sudan. Almost a decade after the revitalized peace agreement was signed, the human rights situation in South Sudan remains deeply concerning. We remain alarmed by continued reports of extrajudicial killings and conflict-related sexual violence. Such acts may constitute serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. Intercommunal violence, fueled by political tensions, competition over resources, and the proliferation of small arms, has resulted in significant loss of life. Women and children are disproportionately affected, with alarming rates of gender-based violence and child recruitment by armed actors. Accountability for serious crimes remains limited. North Macedonia calls for restoring the legal supremacy of the revitalized agreement as the sole legitimate framework for restoring peace and preventing further violations. We reiterate the calls for cessation of attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and guarantee unimpeded humanitarian access. We underscore the state's primary responsibility to protect its population and to ensure credible accountability processes. The establishment and operationalization of transitional justice mechanisms, including the hybrid court, must not be further delayed. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the Commission for its report and update and appreciate the transitional governments of South Sudan's continued cooperation with human rights mechanisms. We remain, however, gravely concerned by the ongoing severe deterioration of human rights in the country. We call on the parties to return to the revitalized peace agreement immediately, release all political detainees, and work towards fully implementing all of its elements. Rampant impunity and lack of political willingness to ensure accountability for human rights abuses, including through the hybrid court, have propelled the country back to the brink of open warfare. The escalation of violence in Western Equatoria, Upper Nile and Jonglei further the risk of a full-scale conflict. Deeply entrenched corruption fuels conflict and lays the grounds for it to take hold in the face of underfinanced institutions, unpaid civil servants and a people in lack of basic services. We urge South Sudan to make sure its resources are channeled into the proper structures and institutions and to combat economic predation. Honoured members of the Commission, what can the international community do to support a return to the revitalized peace agreement and to enable accountability in the face of widespread impunity? Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, Ghana aligns with the statement of the African Group and expresses appreciation to the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. Ghana is alarmed by the grave issues highlighted in the Commission's report, particularly the precarious civilian security situation, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearance, mass displacement, and food security. We welcome the government of South Sudan's continued commitment to implementing the revitalized agreement and also acknowledge steps taken by South Sudanese authorities towards holding general elections in December 2026. Mr. President, we further support the AU's call for the deployment of technical experts on disarmament demobilization, and reintegration, in addition to the delivery of financial and logistical assistance to facilitate the organization of inclusive, peaceful, and credible elections. We also call on the Council and all stakeholders to provide the necessary support to complete this transitional roadmap by strengthening coordinated assistance through diplomatic engagement, technical assistance, and capacity building for national institutions. Finally, Ghana reaffirms its unwavering commitment to supporting collective international efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful South Sudan free from armed conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President. President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and with the statement delivered by the UK on behalf of the core group. We are gravely concerned, President, by the escalating conflict in Jonglei State, and we urge all parties to engage in a meaningful dialogue and to agree an immediate cessation of hostilities. We further urge all parties to re-engage with the 2018 revitalised peace agreement. Ireland strongly condemns the ongoing violence against civilians, humanitarian and healthcare workers, and calls on all parties to respect international humanitarian and human rights law. We are particularly concerned by the impact of the conflict on women and girls, who are subject to widespread sexual and gender-based violence. Such actions are unconscionable and must stop. It is imperative that the perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses are held accountable. Democratic and civic space is continuing to shrink, and we urge the transitional government to take the necessary steps to meet their obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The transitional government must take proactive steps to root out systemic corruption and ensure that state resources are utilised to improve the lives of all citizens. Commissioners, what concrete actions can the international community realistically take to support the implementation of the revitalised peace agreement? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. We commend the government of South Sudan for the tangible progress made in implementing the revitalized peace agreement and its efforts to promote and protect human rights of its people despite the many challenges. We also acknowledge the government's commitment to creating conditions conducive to peaceful, inclusive, fair and credible elections planned for December 2026, while recognizing the practical challenges related to the census and constitutional requirements. We urge the international community to provide the necessary support to assist South Sudan. We reaffirm our support and solidarity with the government and people of South Sudan in their pursuit of lasting peace, stability, and development. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan expresses its appreciation for the Commission's report. We would also like to thank the United Nations mission in South Sudan for its ongoing commitment to protecting civilians in South Sudan. Japan remains concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in South Sudan, including mass displacement caused by the conflict both domestically and to neighboring countries. In particular, the intensified fighting in Jonglei and western and eastern Equatoria, which is escalating the risk of insecurity, famine, and public health crisis, is a grave concern. Japan condemns in the strongest terms the continued attacks against civilians, including humanitarian personnel in South Sudan. Japan calls on the transitional government to take immediate action to end the conflict, prevent further targeting of humanitarian personnel, hold perpetrators accountable, and ensure the safety of those providing life-saving assistance to the South Sudanese people. We also call on all parties to agree to an immediate cessation of hostilities and to resolve issues through peaceful dialogue. Japan remains committed to continuing to work with South Sudan and the international community to protect and promote human rights in South Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Gambia aligns itself with the statement delivered by Kenya on behalf of the African Group and thanks the High Commissioner and the Commission members for the presentation of the report. We applaud the government of South Sudan for the cooperation extended to the Office of the High Commissioner and for its continuing engagement with the Commission, which reflects its regard for the Council's mechanism. However, we note with concern the multiple and complex security and governance challenges outlined in the report, which directly impacts the enjoyment of human rights by the people of South Sudan, especially women and children. We encourage the government of South Sudan to renew its commitment to the full implementation of the revitalized peace agreement, including the establishment and operationalization of the transitional justice mechanisms, notably the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing and the Hybrid Court. Progress in these areas is essential for enduring peace and sustainable development of South Sudan. In this context, the Gambia underscores the importance of sustained and coordinated international support to assist South Sudan in strengthening national institutions to address the human rights challenges. Finally, we encourage South Sudan to continue its constructive engagement and cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner and the Council's mechanisms. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
President Sierra Leone aligns itself for the statements delivered by the African Group and thanks the Commission for the report. We welcome the government's ongoing engagements with the Council's mechanisms. We also recognize the progress made towards the December 26 elections, including the inclusive measures introduced through the Tumaina initiative, which promotes national cohesion. We know that ensuring sustainable protection of human rights in South Sudan depends on strengthening domestic institutions, particularly the judiciary, and unifying the armed forces. For long-term stability and accountability, national ownership of the peace process is essential. We emphasize that the role of the international community should be guided by constructive partnership and solidarity. At this critical juncture, technical assistance and capacity building supports are indispensable for enabling South Sudanese institutions to effectively implement the transitional roadmap. We request that the Council and development partners provide the necessary resources and sustained engagement to consolidate peace, enhance national cohesion, and ensure that the people of South Sudan realize their aspirations for a stable and prosperous country. We encourage the governments of South Sudan to consider the Commission's recommendations to strengthen its democratic institutions and effectively implement the revitalized agreements. And I thank you, President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Mr. President, Zimbabwe commends the government of South Sudan for its continued constructive engagement and cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other human rights mechanisms. We also commend South Sudan for constructively engaging in the ongoing dialogue with regional partners through AU and IGAD. Whilst we recognize South Sudan's readiness to constructively re-engage through the Tumain initiative, we are worried by the escalation of conflict in some parts of the country. We underscore the need to de-escalate current security situation and urge the government to restore order and security in the affected areas. We call for the protection of civilians, especially women and children, and urge all South Sudanese parties to address outstanding issues in the revitalized agreement. We acknowledge the government of Sudan's commitment to creating a conducive environment for peaceful and transparent elections planned for December 2026. We call on the Council to address South Sudan under Agenda Item 10 to enable it to obtain technical assistance and capacity building, which it currently needs to finalize its transition. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia aligns itself with the statement of the African Group. Ethiopia welcomes and acknowledges the continued efforts undertaken by South Sudan to advance peace, security, sustainable development, and the promotion and protection of human rights since the signing of the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan in 2018. That agreement remains the cornerstone of South Sudan's peace process and a vital framework guiding the country's transition toward stability, national reconciliation, and institutional consolidation. Ethiopia firmly believes that the human rights situation in every country should be assessed in an objective, impartial, and constructive manner, with full respect for national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of states. We commend South Sudan for its constructive engagement with the Universal Periodic Review process, OHCHR and the Human Rights Council. We further note with appreciation the continued cooperation between South Sudan and regional partners, including the constructive engagements held recently in Addis Ababa, which have contributed to advancing dialogue, coordination and support for the peace process. Such engagements underscore the importance of regional solidarity and African-led solutions in accompanying South Sudan's transition. In closing, Ethiopia calls upon the international community to enhance its coordinated support to South Sudan. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La Suisse remercie la Commission pour son travail essentiel de documentation sur la situation des droits humains au Soudan du Sud, trop souvent relégué au second plan de l'attention internationale. Nous remercions également les autres panélistes pour leurs précieuses interventions. La Suisse demeure profondément préoccupée par l'intensification des affrontements armés, en particulier dans l'État de Jonglei, ainsi que par les actions incitant à la violence. Cette dangereuse escalade intervient alors que les fondations politiques du processus de paix sont déjà gravement fragilisées. Nous appelons toutes les parties à respecter pleinement le droit international humanitaire et les droits humains, à mettre fin aux violences et à garantir un accès humanitaire sûr, rapide et sans entrave à toutes les personnes dans le besoin. En outre, nous condamnons avec la plus grande fermeté les assassinats de tous les travailleurs humanitaires et demandons que leur protection soit assurée sans délai. Nous exhortons les autorités sud-soudanaises et les partenaires régionaux et internationaux à se réengager d'urgence afin de préserver l'accord de paix revitalisé pour revenir vers la voie politique et la reprise du dialogue sur laquelle ils se sont engagés. Cette inaction fait courir le risque d'un conflit généralisé et d'une tragédie additionnelle. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias, señor presidente. República Dominicana, aunque reconoce ciertos avances, observa con profunda preocupación la evolución de la situación de los derechos humanos en Sudán del Sur a la luz de la información presentada y agradece la exposición del informe. Nos inquieta particularmente el impacto de la violencia sobre civiles, en particular mujeres y niñas, lo que evidencia la fragilidad de los mecanismos de protección existentes. Asimismo, tomamos nota de las denuncias sobre detenciones arbitrarias, tortura y otros abusos cometidos durante operaciones de seguridad, lo que subraya la necesidad de fortalecer el Estado de Derecho y las garantías procesales. República Dominicana alienta a las autoridades y a todas las partes a implementar plenamente los compromisos del Acuerdo de Paz revitalizado, reforzar la protección de la población civil y asegurar la rendición de cuentas. Reiteramos la importancia del acompañamiento internacional para apoyar la estabilidad y la consolidación de la paz en el país. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now call on the distinguished representative of Spain.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos su informe a los comisionados, a los panelistas sus presentaciones y, sobre todo, a los representantes de la sociedad civil su coraje. España se suma a la declaración de la Unión Europea y también acompaña al grupo africano en la preocupación que compartimos por la persistente violencia en Sudán del Sur y las continuas violaciones de los derechos humanos. No van a escuchar en mi intervención muchos elementos novedosos. Compartimos la centralidad del acuerdo de paz revitalizado y el llamamiento a los líderes del país a que lo apliquen con plenitud. Sí querría subrayar la necesidad de garantizar una participación plena, igualitaria y significativa de las mujeres, libres de intimidación y de represalias, así como la inclusión de la juventud y la sociedad civil en los procesos de reconciliación que son indispensables para asegurar una paz sostenible. Somos también partidarios de la creación de un tribunal híbrido para Sudán del Sur y reconocemos la relevante labor que está desempeñando la Comisión, cuya renovación vamos a apoyar en esta sesión del Consejo. Querría plantearles a los miembros de la Comisión una pregunta sobre cómo piensan que se pueden poner las notables riquezas naturales del país al servicio de los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, President. The humanitarian situation in South Sudan is extremely severe. Millions of people internally displaced by conflict, coupled with natural disasters, famine and disease. Humanitarian assistance has been hindered in ongoing clashes. Access denial by all sides to humanitarian assistance must stop immediately. South Sudan's problems require peaceful solutions. The parties to the 2018 peace agreement should be held fully to their obligations under that agreement. The transitional government's component from the opposition must be representative of the reality in the country. The elections to be held in December 2026, to which all sides agreed to, should be held. This could be possible only if there is a return to meaningful dialogue between the parties to the 2018 agreement. Turkey enjoys friendly and good relations with the Republic of South Sudan. Turkey was among the first countries recognizing South Sudan's independence. Continued support to the Republic of South Sudan is critical. We must provide concrete support to the South Sudanese people in their efforts to ensure security, stability, peace and prosperity in their country. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, I call on the distinguished representative of China.
主席先生，中方注意到南苏丹人权状况委员会所作报告，和平与发展是享有人权的基础和保障。中方欢迎南政府为缓和当前安全局势所作努力，赞赏南政府同各方进行建设性接触，在执行振兴协议方面取得进展，并通过非盟和政府间发展组织与区域伙伴开展持续对话。中方一贯主张各方就人权问题开展建设性对话，反对将人权问题政治化。国际社会应给予南更多理解和支持，根据南自身需求提供必要援助，帮助南发展经济、改善民生、促进团结和解。中方将一如既往积极参与联合国维和行动，为南提供力所能及的支持与帮助，为南早日实现持久和平与发展繁荣发挥建设性作用。谢谢主席先生。
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, обстановка в Южном Судане далека от стабилизации. Столкновения между правительственными войсками и сторонниками оппозиции не прекращаются. Военные действия охватывают обширные территории, что ведет к росту числа жертв среди мирного населения. Напряженная обстановка в стране представляет серьезную угрозу для всего субрегиона, создает предпосылки для масштабной дестабилизации в условиях прозрачности границ, способствующей перетеканию боевиков и росту незаконной торговли оружием. Обеспокоены тяжелой гуманитарной ситуацией в Южном Судане, усугубляемой сезонными природными катаклизмами, а также притоком сотен тысяч беженцев, возвращающихся на родину южносуданцев. Исходим из того, что улучшение положения в области прав человека в Южном Судане станет возможным после окончательного урегулирования внутреннего конфликта. Исключительную важность в данном контексте имеют усилия африканского сообщества, направленные на мирное разблокирование нынешнего военно-политического кризиса в Южном Судане. Важной составляющей продвижения страны к миру является деятельность миссии ООН в Южном Судане. В этой связи решительно осуждаем любые акты насилия, направленные против голубых касок представителей гуманитарных организаций и гражданского населения. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente. Venezuela reconoce la complejidad de la situación en Sudán del Sur. Sin embargo, desea expresar su profunda preocupación ante la persistencia de algunos países en este Consejo en imponer resoluciones que no cuenten con el respaldo del país concernido. Reafirmamos nuestra postura de principios contra el uso de este espacio para promover iniciativas politizadas contra cualquier país. La imposición de mecanismos punitivos, lejos de ayudar, profundizan las brechas de desconfianza. Creemos firmemente que el respeto mutuo y el diálogo genuino deben prevalecer en el marco del respeto a la soberanía y a la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los Estados. Este Consejo debe retomar su esencia original, ser un espacio de diálogo genuino y cooperación constructiva, alejándose de las lógicas de confrontación, politización o dobles raseros. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. This was the last speaker on my list for states. We will therefore end this session now. We will reconvene this afternoon at 2:30 p.m. to continue the enhanced interactive dialogue on the report of the Commission of Human Rights in South Sudan. And following that, the Council will hold the interactive dialogue on the oral update of the High Commissioner on Rohingya, Muslims, and other minorities in Myanmar, followed by the presentation of reports under Item 2. I therefore declare now to close the 10th meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council.